40 floors above the marble lobby of First National Bank, a woman in a simple navy suit held $5 billion in her hands. The contract was already drafted, the lawyers nodding, the executives celebrating a deal that would transform their institution forever. But on her phone screen, a security feed showed something they couldn't see: an elderly black man on his knees, a state ID card spinning across cold marble, a bank manager's satisfied smirk. None of them knew the trembling woman watching this humiliation was Maya Thompson, owner of 7 invisible empires. None of them knew the man on his knees was her father. In 30 seconds, everything would change. What would you do if you witnessed your father's dignity stripped away by those begging for your business? Maya Thompson moved through Detroit's financial district like a whisper among shouts. At 42, she chose navy blue suits from department stores over designer labels, her natural hair wrapped in a simple silk scarf that her mother had given her 20 years ago. When she entered restaurants, hostesses often directed her to the takeout counter before she could speak. When she flew first class, flight attendants double-checked her ticket, their surprise poorly concealed behind professional smiles. She never corrected their assumptions, never flashed her black cards or mentioned the 7 companies she owned. Instead, she settled into their low expectations like a comfortable coat, invisible by choice rather than circumstance. The only hint of her true worth sat on her collar, a small bronze compass pin, tarnished with age but precisely maintained. Her father had given it to her when she was 8, the day after her teacher said, "Black girls shouldn't waste time on advanced mathematics." That compass had guided her through MIT at 19, through doctoral defenses where committee members questioned whether she'd really authored her own research, through boardrooms where executives addressed their questions to her white male assistant. She touched it now, sitting in First National Bank's opulent conference room, as 12 executives explained why her money was good enough for them, even if her skin wasn't. Thompson Industries operated from a converted warehouse on Detroit's east side, its exterior deliberately unremarkable. No gleaming corporate logo, no marble lobby, just a simple bronze plaque by the door. Inside, 300 engineers and scientists worked on technologies that would define the next century. The break room displayed photos not of corporate galas but of company picnics, children's science fairs, and ribbon cuttings at the community centers Maya funded anonymously. Her employees knew her as Miss M, the boss who remembered birthdays and college tuition struggles, who showed up at 3 in the morning when production hit snags, who wore steel-toed boots on the factory floor just like everyone else. The world knew Thompson Industries as a modest success story, a black-owned business that had somehow survived where others failed. They didn't know about Vertex Dynamics, the defense contractor whose innovations protected American soldiers. They didn't know about Meridian Technologies, whose patents powered half the smartphones on Earth. They didn't know about Aurora Systems, Nexus Manufacturing, Quantum Solutions, or Precision Instruments, all owned by Maya through a web of holdings so complex that even forensic accountants would need months to unravel it. She'd learned early that visible success made you a target. Better to be underestimated than undermined. Her father, Robert Thompson, had taught her this lesson without words. For 35 years, he'd worked the assembly line at Ford's River Rouge plant, capable of innovations that could have revolutionized production. But he'd watched white colleagues claim credit for his ideas, seen his suggestions implemented under other names, learned that survival sometimes meant letting others believe they were superior. He'd saved every penny, worked every holiday shift, sold his blood plasma to pay for Maya's textbooks. When she'd wanted to quit MIT after a professor told her she was taking a spot from someone more deserving, Robert had driven 10 hours through a snowstorm to sit in her dorm room. "Baby girl," he'd said, holding her hands scarred from decades of factory work, "they can't steal what's in your mind. But sometimes you got to hide it until the right moment." 25 years ago, that moment had seemed to arrive. Dr. Maya Thompson, fresh from defending 2 dissertations that MIT's review board called paradigm shifting, had been recruited by Morrison Technologies with promises of unlimited research funding and complete creative freedom. James Morrison himself had flown to Boston, taken her to dinner at restaurants where the wine cost more than her father's monthly salary, painted visions of a partnership that would change the world. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? He'd looked her in the eye and said her brilliance humbled him, that he wanted to learn from her, that together they would build an empire of innovation. For 3 years, it had seemed true. Her lab at Morrison Technologies produced breakthrough after breakthrough. The composite material that made aircraft 50% lighter while doubling strength. The battery technology that could power electric vehicles for 1,000 miles on a single charge. The manufacturing process that reduced production costs by 70% while eliminating toxic waste. She worked 18-hour days, slept in the lab more often than her apartment, lived on coffee and the pure joy of discovery. Morrison provided the funding and the freedom, appearing occasionally for photos with investors, always careful to credit his brilliant partner. She'd thought she'd found the rarest thing in corporate America, a white man who actually recognized her worth. The betrayal began with small things, meetings she wasn't invited to, documents that required Morrison's signature alone, patents filed with slight variations to her work, crediting his team. When she questioned him, he'd laughed, called her paranoid, reminded her that partnerships required trust. Then came the accident. Her car's brakes failed on a clear day with no traffic, sending her through a guardrail and down an embankment. She'd survived by pure chance. A tree had caught the vehicle before it reached the river. But the 3 weeks in a coma gave Morrison all the time he needed. He transferred her research, backdated invention disclosures, even hired an actress to play a lab assistant who swore Maya had only implemented Morrison's ideas. She'd awakened to find herself erased, her keycard deactivated, her lab reassigned, her name removed from every patent application. Morrison's lawyers, led by the infamous Victoria Ashford, had been waiting with a settlement offer. Take $50,000 and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or face a defamation lawsuit that would bankrupt her. When she'd refused, when she'd tried to fight, they'd unleashed a campaign of character assassination that would have impressed dictators. Suddenly, anonymous sources were telling reporters about her instability, her jealousy, her delusions of grandeur. The security footage of her working alone in the lab mysteriously disappeared. Her doctoral advisors received threatening letters about their funding if they supported her. The trial lasted 18 months. Every day, she'd sat in that courtroom as Morrison's team painted her as a mentally unstable woman who couldn't accept her limitations. They'd hired experts to question whether someone of her background could really understand such complex science. They'd suggested her degrees were the result of affirmative action rather than ability. When she'd presented her original notebooks, they'd claimed she'd forged them. When former colleagues testified on her behalf, Morrison's investigators found ways to discredit them. A decades-old arrest, a tax dispute, anything to muddy the waters. The jury, 11 white faces and 1 black woman who wouldn't meet her eyes, deliberated for less than an hour. As the verdict was read, Morrison had walked past her table, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Some people are meant to be servants, not masters. Next time, know your place." The courtroom had erupted in his celebration, while Maya sat frozen, watching her life's work become his fortune. That night, she'd stood on the Belle Isle Bridge, staring at the Detroit River's dark current, wondering if erasure could be more complete. Her phone had rung, her father calling as he did every night at 9:30. "Just checking on my baby girl," he'd said, and something in his voice, some mixture of love and stubborn faith, had pulled her back from the edge. She'd driven home, parked in her parents' driveway, and collapsed in her childhood bed. First National Bank's boardroom occupied the entire 40th floor, its windows offering panoramic views of a city most of its executives had never actually explored. Maya sat at the far end of the conference table, her navy suit unremarkable among the Italian tailoring surrounding her. CFO Bradley Sterling was midway through his presentation, laser pointer dancing over projections of Detroit's transformation under Thompson Industries' Clean Energy Initiative. The other executives nodded along, seeing dollar signs in every solar panel and wind turbine. They'd been courting her for 6 months, each offer more desperate than the last as larger banks tried to poach the deal. Miss Thompson's vision for sustainable manufacturing could revolutionize not just Detroit but the entire Midwest, Sterling proclaimed, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd never set foot in a factory. First National Bank is proud to partner with forward-thinking leaders who understand that diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords. They're the future of American business. Several executives applauded softly, congratulating themselves on their progressive attitudes. Maya touched her compass pin, remembering her father's advice about keeping your face neutral when people revealed their true selves without realizing it. The contract was a masterpiece of legal language, 500 pages detailing how First National would provide $5 billion in funding for Thompson Industries' clean energy project. In return, the bank would get naming rights, preferred rates on all Thompson Company's accounts, and the kind of positive publicity that money usually couldn't buy. They'd already leaked hints to the financial press, their stock price rising on rumors of the deal. Maya had let them believe she was grateful for their attention, that a black woman from Detroit should be honored by their interest. They had no idea she'd turned down larger offers from banks that didn't require her to perform gratitude. Her phone, face down on the table, vibrated with an alert. She'd configured her security system to notify her whenever her parents entered any building her companies monitored, a safety measure born from hard experience. Maya glanced at the notification. Robert Thompson had entered First National's main branch downstairs. Her father maintained his accounts at the same branch where he'd opened his first savings account in 1968. Too loyal to change even when online banking made physical visits unnecessary. She almost dismissed the alert, then noticed a second notification. The facial recognition system had identified Richard Hawthorne approaching her father's position. "Excuse me for just one moment," Maya said quietly, turning her phone to watch the security feed. The executives barely noticed, deep in discussion about quarterly projections and market penetration. On her screen, her father stood at the teller window, probably depositing his Social Security check with the same methodical care he'd shown for 5 decades. He wore his good suit, the charcoal gray one he'd bought for her college graduation, and maintained with military precision ever since. The young teller smiled at him, fingers flying over her keyboard, the transaction nearly complete. Then Hawthorne appeared, his swagger visible even on the small screen, gesturing for the teller to step aside. Maya increased the volume just as Hawthorne's voice boomed through the marble lobby. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the window immediately." Her father, confused but compliant, took a small step backward. "No," Hawthorne continued, his tone sharp with authority. "Further back. We've had reports of fraudulent checks in this area, and I need to verify your identity before we can process any transactions." The teller started to protest that she'd already verified everything, but Hawthorne silenced her with a look that promised consequences. Maya watched her father's shoulders tense, the only sign that he recognized this dance he'd performed too many times before. Robert Thompson pulled out his state ID card, the same one he'd used at this bank for decades. Hawthorne took it with 2 fingers, as if it might be contaminated, holding it up to the light with exaggerated suspicion. "This photo doesn't match," he announced loudly. "How do I know you didn't steal this from the real Robert Thompson?" Maya's father replied calmly that he'd be happy to provide additional identification. He produced his veteran's card from Vietnam, his Medicare card, his library card from the Detroit Public Library where he'd volunteered for 20 years. Hawthorne waved each away with increasing disdain, his performance drawing stares from other customers. "These could all be forged," Hawthorne declared, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "We take fraud very seriously here at First National. I'm going to need you to wait while I call the police to verify your identity." Several white customers averted their eyes, uncomfortable but silent. A young Latina mother pulled her children closer, her face a mask of recognition. An elderly black man in line shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath, but nobody intervened. Nobody spoke up. They all knew the script, knew their roles, knew that challenging Hawthorne would only make them the next target. "Miss Thompson?" Sterling's assistant touched her shoulder gently. "We really need your signature on Section 4 to proceed." But Maya couldn't look away from her screen. Hawthorne had summoned 2 security guards, young men whose hands rested on their tasers as they flanked her father. "I've seen this before," Hawthorne lectured the growing crowd. "They come in here with their fake IDs and stolen checks, preying on hard-working people's trust. We have to be vigilant." The words "they" and "their" dripped with decades of prejudice, each syllable a small violence. Robert Thompson stood perfectly still, dignity wrapped around him like armor, but Maya could see the slight tremor in his hands. "Look at this ID," Hawthorne continued, holding her father's card high for everyone to see. "The photo's obviously old. This could be anyone's grandfather. For all we know, the real Robert Thompson is lying in a ditch somewhere, while this criminal empties his accounts." The security guards nodded along, eager apprentices learning their trade. One pulled out his phone, pretending to call for backup. The other rested his hand more firmly on his taser, as if a 71-year-old veteran posed a legitimate threat. Maya's hand gripped her phone so tightly the case creaked. In the boardroom, executives discussed interest rates and loan structures, oblivious to the violence being performed in their name downstairs. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist that he'd probably practiced, Hawthorne sent the ID card spinning through the air. It hit the marble floor with a plastic click that echoed through the lobby, sliding across the polished surface until it stopped near a potted fern. "If that's really yours," Hawthorne sneered, his voice dripping with contempt, "then you won't mind picking it up. Prove to everyone here that you're really Robert Thompson." The lobby fell silent except for the whisper of air conditioning and someone's nervous cough. Time seemed to freeze as every eye turned to Maya's father, waiting to see if he would bend, if he would kneel, if he would perform the submission Hawthorne demanded. For a moment that stretched like years, Robert Thompson stood still. Maya could see him weighing his options, calculating the cost of dignity against the need to complete his errand. She knew he was thinking of her, of the times he'd bitten his tongue and bowed his head so she could hold hers high. Then, with movements made painful by arthritis earned through decades of honest labor, he began to bend. His knees protested. His back, injured in a plant accident that management had blamed on his carelessness, screamed as he lowered himself toward the floor. The security guard smirked. Hawthorne crossed his arms in satisfaction. And Maya watched her father, the man who'd built her dreams with bleeding hands, kneel on a cold bank floor to retrieve his own identification. As Robert's fingers closed around the ID card, Hawthorne delivered his final humiliation. "Maybe next time try the check cashing place on 8 Mile. I hear they're more accommodating to people like you." He turned to the crowd, playing to his audience. "First National Bank maintains the highest standards of security and customer service. We apologize for any inconvenience, but I'm sure you understand we have to protect our valued customers from potential fraud." Several people nodded, grateful that their checking accounts were safe from the dangerous black man who'd just been forced to his knees. The young teller behind the counter had tears in her eyes, but she stayed silent, knowing her job depended on it. For a moment that lasted forever, Maya sat frozen in the boardroom, her father's humiliation playing on repeat in her mind. She thought of every sacrifice he'd made, every dream he'd deferred, every injury he'd endured, so she could sit in rooms like this. The old Maya, the one who'd learned to compartmentalize and compromise, whispered that she could still sign the deal, take their $5 billion and transform Detroit, employ thousands, prove that success was the best revenge. All it required was pretending she hadn't seen her father on his knees, hadn't watched him retrieve his dignity from a bank floor while security guards laughed. But then her phone buzzed with a text. "Deposit done, baby girl. Hope your big meeting goes well. Love you." No mention of what had just happened. No complaint about his treatment. Just love and encouragement. The same as every day for 42 years. Maya read it again, her vision blurring. How many floors had he scraped with his dignity so she could walk on marble? How many times had he swallowed rage so she could speak freely? How many pieces of himself had he sacrificed on the altar of her success? The compass on her collar seemed to burn, its needle pointing toward a truth she'd spent 25 years avoiding. Sterling coughed politely. "Miss Thompson, I hate to rush you, but we really do need those signatures. The board meeting is in 45 minutes, and they're expecting to announce this partnership." He slid the contract closer, his Mont Blanc pen gleaming under the conference room lights. Around the table, 12 executives waited with barely concealed impatience, already calculating their bonuses from this deal. They saw her hesitation as negotiation tactics, maybe angling for better terms. They couldn't imagine that she was weighing their $5 billion against her father's dignity and finding their money worthless. Maya stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The shadow was about to reveal its substance, the whisper about to become a roar. She thought of Morrison's sneer, of Ashford's condescension, of every person who'd tried to erase her. They'd all made the same mistake, confusing her strategic invisibility with weakness, her patience with powerlessness. Today, First National Bank was about to receive an education in the difference between being unseen and being insignificant. She touched her phone, and the boardroom's main screen flickered to life. The executives straightened, expecting another revenue projection. Instead, they saw their bank's lobby, their manager, their culture laid bare in high definition. "Gentlemen," Maya said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the room, "I believe you should see exactly what kind of institution you're asking me to partner with." On the screen, Hawthorne threw the ID. Her father bent to retrieve it. The security guard smirked. The crowd watched in complicit silence. Sterling's face went white as he recognized his bank's logo, his manager's voice, his lobby's marble floors. The other executives grabbed phones and tablets, frantically texting subordinates, trying to understand how this could be happening. But Maya wasn't finished. She swiped her phone again, and the screen filled with data they'd never thought to look for. "The man your manager just humiliated is Robert Thompson, my father. The man whose name my primary company bears." Her voice remained calm, but underneath lay steel forged in decades of controlled fury. "What your research team failed to discover is that Thompson Industries is merely the tip of an iceberg. I also own Vertex Dynamics, Meridian Technologies, Aurora Systems, Nexus Manufacturing, Quantum Solutions, and Precision Instruments. Combined, my companies control over 3,000 patents in aerospace, defense, energy, and manufacturing. We employ 67,000 people across 15 states. Our innovations power half the technology you use daily without knowing it." The room erupted as executives searched databases they'd never connected, uncovering a web of ownership that spanned industries. Maya continued, each word precise as a surgical cut. "The autonomous driving system Mercedes just announced, built on my patents. The new cancer treatment protocol Johns Hopkins is testing, based on my biomedical research. The classified defense project that just received $2 billion in funding, they're licensing 12 of my innovations." She pulled up contract after contract, each representing relationships and revenue streams First National had never imagined. "Your own investment portfolio includes 3 companies that depend entirely on my technology. Without my patents, they cease to exist." "But here's what should really concern you," Maya said, command filling her voice. "First National currently manages pension funds for 4 of my companies. You process payroll for 38,000 of my employees. Your wealth management division has been pursuing my personal accounts for 2 years." She paused, letting them calculate the implications. "All of those relationships end today. Every pension fund, every payroll account, every investment will be moved to institutions that don't require my employees' families to grovel on marble floors. The $5 billion deal you thought you'd secured? Goldman Sachs offered $7 billion with better terms. I chose you because you claim to value community and dignity. Your manager just showed me what those words mean to you." Sterling stammered, his composure finally cracking. "Miss Thompson, please, this is all a terrible misunderstanding. Hawthorne's actions don't represent our values. We'll terminate him immediately, implement new training, issue a public apology." Maya held up her hand, and he fell silent. She picked up the unsigned contract, holding it so they could see their dreams dissolving. "Mr. Sterling, you've had decades to address this culture. Every time someone like Hawthorne felt comfortable humiliating customers in your lobby, you failed. Every time an employee stayed silent, you failed. Every time you chose profits over people, you failed. Today, you're learning that failure has a price." The executives watched in growing panic as she gathered her materials. One junior vice president actually stepped toward the door as if to block her exit, then thought better of it. Maya smiled, but it held no warmth. "Gentlemen, you wanted to know who Monsieur Thompson was. Now you do. I'm someone who spent 25 years building an empire in shadows because people like you taught me that visible success made me a target. I'm someone who learned to hide my power because men like Morrison showed me what happened when I displayed it. But I'm also Robert Thompson's daughter, and there are some things more valuable than your money." She reached the door, then turned for one final statement. "Your stock price will fall. Your board will demand answers. Your careers may not survive this. But those are your consequences to bear. I'll build my clean energy project without you. Employ thousands without your backing. Transform Detroit without your name attached. And every time you walk through your marble lobby, you'll remember the day you lost everything because your manager thought my father was worth less than the dirt on your floors. Dignity, gentlemen, is the one thing money can't buy. And it's the one thing I'll never let you steal." The news broke within hours. Financial channels erupted with coverage of the Thompson revelation, as reporters called it. First National's stock price plummeted 40% in after-hours trading, as investors realized the scope of lost business. Richard Hawthorne's termination was announced within minutes, but it was too late. The security footage had already gone viral, shared millions of times with captions about corporate racism and the cost of prejudice. Business schools would later teach entire courses on the incident, analyzing how systemic bias could destroy decades of relationship building in minutes. But Maya Thompson had already moved on. She sat in her parents' kitchen, sharing Chinese takeout from the place on 7 Mile they'd been ordering from since she was 12. Her father hadn't mentioned the incident at the bank, and she hadn't brought it up. They ate in comfortable silence, the evening news playing softly in the background. When the story about First National's catastrophe came on, Robert reached for the remote, but Maya caught his hand. "Let it play, Dad." He looked at her for a long moment, understanding passing between them without words. Then he squeezed her fingers and returned to his General Tso's chicken. "You know you didn't have to do that, baby girl," he said finally, his voice soft with emotion. "I've handled worse. It's just how things are." Maya set down her chopsticks and took both his hands in hers, feeling the scars from decades of factory work, the arthritis from years of repetitive motion, the strength that had held her up through every storm. "That's exactly why I had to do it, Dad. Because you've handled worse. Because you shouldn't have to. Because every time you bent your knee so I could stand tall, you were building toward this moment." She touched the compass on her collar. "You taught me to find my own direction. Today, I finally did." A week later, a 15-year-old black girl named Destiny stood outside Thompson Industries headquarters, clutching a notebook full of engineering designs. She'd seen the news coverage, watched Maya Thompson walk away from billions rather than compromise her principles. But more than that, she'd seen Robert Thompson's quiet dignity, the way he'd maintained his composure even as they tried to strip it away. Destiny's own grandfather had similar stories, similar scars, similar strength. As security welcomed her into the building for the new Youth Innovation Program Maya had announced, Destiny touched the small compass pin on her backpack, a gift from her grandfather just that morning. The security guard, a young black woman named Keisha, smiled warmly. "Miss Thompson is expecting you. She's in the lab on the 3rd floor." As Destiny walked through halls lined with patents and innovations, she passed photos not of corporate victories but of community transformations. Solar panels on housing projects, wind turbines in abandoned lots, job training centers in former factories. At the end of the hall, a simple plaque read, "In honor of Robert Thompson, who taught us that dignity is the foundation on which all success is built." Destiny paused, reading it twice, then headed for the elevator. She had inventions to share with someone who would see their value. In the lab, Maya Thompson worked alongside 3 other teenagers, all bent over a prototype that could revolutionize water purification in urban areas. She wore the same unremarkable navy suit, her hair in the same simple style, but something had changed. The shadow had stepped into the light, not seeking spotlight but simply refusing to hide. When she saw Destiny at the door, she smiled and waved her over. "Welcome. I hear you have some ideas about improving solar panel efficiency. Let's see what you've got." As Destiny opened her notebook, hands trembling with excitement, Maya touched her compass pin once more. True north, she'd learned, wasn't about following anyone else's direction. It was about staying oriented to your own principles, even when the world tried to spin you around. First National Bank never recovered. Within 6 months, They'd lost 40% of their commercial accounts as other business owners reconsidered their relationships. Richard Hawthorne found himself unemployable, his name synonymous with the kind of prejudice companies claimed to abhor. But the real change came in smaller ways. Bank managers across the country instituted new training programs, not because they'd suddenly developed consciences, but because they'd seen the cost of complicity. Young professionals of color walked a little taller, knowing that sometimes justice wore a navy suit and carried a compass instead of a sword. Maya Thompson continued building her empire, but no longer in shadows. She gave interviews about innovation and integrity, always mentioning her father's influence, always wearing that compass pin. When Morrison Technologies finally went bankrupt, their stolen innovations made obsolete by her newer developments, she didn't celebrate. She simply hired their best engineers, the ones who'd known the truth but had been too frightened to speak it. Forgiveness, she'd learned, could be its own form of power. But forgetting? That was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every morning, she looked at that photo on her desk, her and her father outside the steel mill, both grinning with determination, and remembered why she built things that couldn't be stolen or destroyed. Some battles are won not with signatures on contracts, but with the courage to say no when yes would be easier. Some victories are measured not in billions gained, but in dignity preserved, and sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let anyone make you kneel for what's already yours. If you were her, watching your father humble himself for men who would never see his worth, would you have signed that contract? Or would you have chosen the harder path, the one that leads not to easy money but to mirrors you can meet without flinching?